All right, well, let's try to catch up to it now. So I want to give an update on a beta project and a quick reminder what Bento actually is. So Nina, could you please go 2 slides up, the next slide? Yeah. Our goal is to enable AMP elements to be used on an AMP or on a non-AMP page, and ideally without AMP runtime. The next slide. A Bento component can be used as a web component, similar to how AMP document work. For instance, here user script can modify web component via DOM and other APIs. I hope you like my scroll back here to jQuery. It should even work with jQuery. The next slide. Or it could look like this. A Bento component can be used directly in your React and Preact and hopefully any other app. And next slide. And a little bit of history before we dig deeper. We decided to move in this direction at the AmpConf 2019. At our last contributor summit, we shared our plans to implement our components in Preact to enable this goal. And now, we're looking at what it will look like. Next slide. So here is how we decided to prioritize our work. First, we are planning to make all web components fully mutable. That means changing an attribute or a child in DOM will be always correctly reflected. Our second step is we are working on making AMP runtime function correctly on non-valid AMP pages. What we historically be calling a dirty AMP will no longer be dirty. This mainly involves removing some of the initial assumptions of a page structure and optimizing for mutability. Third, we wanted to enable AMP web components to work without AMP runtime at all. And finally, we also wanted to enable AMP components to be used in React and Preact apps. The next slide. So let's have a look what progress we've made so far. The next slide. We built the AMP Preact bridge. It's a technology that maps DOM structure of web components to and executes an embedded React component that implements UI and logic. The UI team has actually already used this bridge to build several AMP components. Most importantly, they build different types of components, so we can validate different scenarios of or different categories of UI components and how they would work through this bridge. We also updated AMP support for Preact code style, including JSX support. And we added storybook support for both React and web components. Next slide. So let's see what this all looks like. Let's make a component. Next slide. If you want to build a new component, you should probably start with a Preact component first. It really looks just like any React or Preact component would look like. You can use most of the React APIs and patterns for this. Here, for instance, the feed text component renders the DOM markup and adds a side effect to monitor size changes to implement the resize logic. And again, it looks just like a normal React component you would write. Next slide. Next, we don't want to go too far, and we want to immediately create storybook for our component. As a quick aside, the storybook is a playground tool for UI components. It's a cross somewhere between a code pen and an example page. If you were adding an example page, for instance, your time is now much better spent adding a storybook instead. It has many cool features that I'm not going to cover on right now. But if you squint here, you actually will see that on the left side, you'll see all the different components you might have and their render. The component itself is rendered in the main part of a page and has knobs where you can see how different parameters affect your component. So next page. I want to kind of you to be able to see what it actually looks like. And again, it looks like a React component in a way. It uses JSX to render component itself. It uses special storybook APIs called knobs to accept the user's parameters in those input fields. It's very fast. It's self-documented, and it helps you think in React way when building your component. So next. Now we have React component, and we need to map it to, sorry about that. We need to map it to DOM, or web component, in other words. We could, of course, do it all manually. Read attributes and pass them to React component, read children, set up mutation observers. But we already added some of this typical mapping functionality for you. So here, for instance, AMP fit text AMP component, AMP element, maps to React's fit text component. It instructs it to pass through all of its children. And it also maps a few attributes like min and max font sizes. Okay, next slide. And again, we don't want to go too far. We want to immediately jump and build a storybook. And you can run it using gulp storybook amp command. So very quickly, let's take a look what that storybook looks like on the next slide. So again, very similar to what we've seen before. We just use JSX to render AMP element. We can use knobs and all those features again here. Okay, that was so we built a component. Let's take a look a little bit under the hood. Let's go to the next slide. So we map component to an element and back. What it means is that when you write AMP fit text DOM element in a HTML markup, it maps to fit text component. Attributes are mapped to properties in the simplest cases, and content also maps to components children property. This is a more simple mapping. They could get pretty complicated. Sometimes they're quite complicated, but in the simple cases, content becomes children, attributes become pros. Let's look next slide. So DOM structure is slightly more nuanced here. The React component, it is rendered inside shadow root. Why? Because it adds more markup, and we don't want to mess with whatever user markup is in AMP fit text. So that if user wants to change an attribute or inner HTML of AMP fit text, there is a way to do this without breaking components markup. So this way, component and users markup isolated from each other. So shadow DOM, you can see it adds its own markup. Like in this case, it adds a container, it adds content, it attaches special layout rules to them through CSS, it adds resize observers on them, does everything we've seen before a component does. And slot simply maps inner content of DOM element to React component inside of shadow root. Okay, that's pretty much covers it. So we wanted to see what's next for us here. On the next slide, first we want to ramp up migration of AMP elements to React, and we want to start doing it fairly aggressively very soon. Second, we will further improve React code styles. We still have some inconsistencies what you would normally see in React and React land. Also, we want to support some of the important React APIs. As an example, context API is only partially supported right now, and we want to have a full support available. Third, we are improving and will be improving many of AMP polyfills because we want Preact components to not depend on internal AMP APIs. If before we usually would wrap a polyfill in AMP world in a service to make sure that it can be uploaded dynamically, here we need to make it available right away so that Preact doesn't have unnecessary dependencies. Fourth, we still need to figure out how to distribute CSS style sheets. That's been a bit of a head scratcher. Apparently, there is not a clear, fully consistent way to distribute CSS to your components. It depends on so many different things, how webpacks are configured, how other packaging technologies are working, and so on. So this is still work in progress for us. And finally, we are looking into making web components to run without AMP runtime at all. And to give a bit of a call out to some of the web specs on the next slide that we are actively engaging with. We're working with web community on declarative shadow DOM. This is going to be a great optimization. It will make web components that use shadow DOM fully server-side renderable. So with aspect ratio CSS, we'll extend AMP layout rules to web as a whole. And again, we'll reduce dependencies and make AMP web components executable easier without AMP runtime. And also CSS problem, we're looking at a couple specs and trying to give them proper priority. For instance, custom cascade layers spec potentially could allow CSS for components to be deployed with correct isolation and correct specificity, so that user-land CSS can override properties or not. Okay, next slide is, this is all great, but how can we all help? The next slide. So number one, we can build and rebuild you can rebuild your component in Preact. Please talk to us to see if the set of Preact APIs and DOM mapping styles is something we already support. And we support a fairly wide scope at this point, but not everything. Second, you can build storybooks for existing AMP elements and components. That's kind of a nice way to learn the tool, and it's extremely helpful. I find it very instructive, just even helping you to design component in a more reusable way. Third, you can help us solve some technical problems we haven't solved yet, just like the CSS problem I described a couple of minutes ago. And that's it. Thank you. That was pretty fast, I know, but hopefully leaving some time for questions or.
Yeah, thanks, Dima, and thanks, Nena, for following along with the slides. That was really helpful. Are there any questions about Bento stuff? I know that was a lot of information and some really great updates, but because there's so much information, there might be some questions. So, anybody have anything about Bento? How you can help, any of the technical stuff? While we're waiting for, oh, there we go. Juan says, where can we get the code snippets to play with?
For now, you probably would just have to go from AMP codebase itself, but the good news is that you could just run a storybook. Gallop AMP storybook as one slide has shown storybook Preact, for instance, and you can see all of all Gallop storybook AMP. You can see sets of components, and you can play with them right away there.
I think it was also Caroline saying Gulp Storybook Preact or Gulp Storybook AMP. I think it might have also been Juan yesterday asking about the updates on the where AMP is working on with standards stuff, and so that last slide, it sounded like Bento is one area where we're pushing forward with things. I'm actually,
Yep.
Nina, could you go to that slide about the different work with web specs? Could you give more details on the declarative shadow DOM? I actually didn't quite get what this was.
So a declarative shadow DOM, yeah. So shadow DOM is DOM, right? And normally DOM is can be just loaded, actually streamed from a server, which works very fast. Parsers are very optimized to be able to take it from a wire and try to parse it online. But Shadow DOM historically did not work like this. It had only API that you can create it. So basically, you have to call a special API that's called attach shadow, and that creates Shadow DOM, and that means that you actually have to build contents of Shadow DOM essentially manually through API as well. That unfortunately means that you cannot server-side render it, at least not completely. And that's an obvious delay. By the time the rest of the DOM is already loaded, somewhere up there where Shadow DOM is used has to be built only when script can run. So this has been a big sort of a contention for a while. We didn't know what to do about it there. And actually, the solution here is pretty simple now that we're working with web platform team. The way it happens now, essentially, we can distribute a template tag, which is inert, which means it doesn't execute by itself. But parser, seeing this template tag properly marked up, will automatically start pushing it as a shadow content. And that means that shadow roots can be streamed from a server side. As an example, AMP optimizer can easily create shadow roots or partial shadow roots. An example here would be if carousel requires shadow root, then you can actually push the whole carousel content. Or you could split the difference and push only the first slide, which is still nicer because even before maybe full functionality is available and slides can be swiped, you already see the first slide, which, I mean, for the most people, that's enough. If you're looking at a product, how often do you even start swiping between images, right? You usually look at it this way.
Great.
That's covers it.
And Michael is asking about whether you're able to share the slides. I know the talks, we're recording the talks and we'll be sharing them. For the slides, I think if the presenters are comfortable with it, we can do that as well. Maybe share PDFs out, like that's what we've done in past years. So.
Yeah, totally comfortable with it, except for I don't know where to put them. So
yeah,
you have to.
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier because we have on the amp.dev domain that we have. We don't have the ability to create team folders to share, but we should be able to figure something out there.
I'll definitely put a issue on a WG Bento
nice.
A working group, which is, by the way, to give it a call out, WG Bento is a pretty good but WG Bento is a good source of information for all of this progress on the Bento. So I'll put it there as well.
Great. And then Juan is asking, is all the Bento work in a public GitHub repo? Yes,
absolutely. So we have most of the work concentrated in WG Bento. Like a lot of Bento specific issues are there, especially if they are very discovery in nature. Like for instance, CSS. There might be 5 or 6 issues already in a Bento. We're trying to work it, figure it out. The work itself, of course, is done in AMP repo, AMP HTML repo. And we usually only put issues that are confirmed. Okay, we're moving in this direction now. So we start putting work at that point in AMP HTML. And of course, our actual components are all there.
Yeah, this is a very active area, so this would be a great place if people want to contribute if they're really excited about this effort. I think I actually didn't. I might have missed in the slide, but the current status. I know that there are like 4 or 5 components that are done, but you're doing a couple more to make sure that the APIs all seem correct. Is that right?
Yeah. So basically, we've done different types of components. Like we have components that render themselves, like time ago. It's actually just renders its own content. We have components that basically shadowed root themselves, like feed text. We have components that completely exist in a user markup, like selector, and basically React component just wraps around them and provides logic, but doesn't really render itself. We have these different types of components. That's what we were looking for. So now we're working on like really high composite components, composable components like carousel, and video players is like a big category. And of course, when you say video player, there is probably maybe 20 of them. So that's like a immediately big chunk of big population of AMP components there. So once I think we have some of the video players and some of the carousels, we would be looking to ramp it up very aggressively, because at that point we will know that APIs are stable. But for now, we are sort of moving a bit more cautiously.
Great, and it looks like Michael shared a link to Bento PRs that have been completed. So it's great. Any other questions about Bento? Oh, from Sarah, is the Bento roadmap mentioned in the video, is region restricted video also included?
I would probably not be able to comment on that because I don't know what it is. But video components, like if it can exist as a app, basically, if it can exist as a web component, it should also exist as a Bento component eventually.
I'm not sure if Alan or anybody from the UI team is here that's familiar with the what this might be.
If you're interested,
yeah, Alan,
in having video that's restricted to region video, I'd recommend opening a ticket on the AMP HTML repo. We can figure out what the requirements are.
Yeah, and then we can follow with these requirements to Bento World as well. So it looks like next question is yes. So the eventual goal, is to make them completely universal, and that's what we would like to have, because it would be kind of confusing to have 2 types. But it is, of course, a little bit harder to disentangle from runtime, since that hasn't been the case before. And but it's doable. I think we will get there. For our first goal, however, is to make AMP runtime to be kind of unintrusive by itself. So even if you have a non-AMP page, you can still put v0.js. It kind of a little bit of a has fewer assumptions, does a little bit less on your page. It just provides this common layer for components to function in a Bento world. At least for now, that's our first step. And of course, eventually, once fewer API dependencies exist, we can make a jump and say, well, this AMP component can already be used by itself.
Great. And then Juan is asking, will AMP become a Bento first library for new components when we get there? So new extensions are also standalone.
Aspirationally, yes. Essentially, I mean, we hope that it will significantly lower a barrier of entry for components. Essentially, as soon as you have React component that we like out there, good license, good implementation, consideration of performance, layout shifts, like all the core vitals, like for instance, we talked about, it doesn't jump, it does not, it prepares to paint itself fast and doesn't block input delay, doesn't use excessive API access to like grab scrolling, intercept scrolling from a page. If we like this, we potentially just map it to a web component and we're done, right? It's pretty much available right away. That could be the future here.
Great. Any other questions? Is there a rough ETA for the lighter vo.js? Michael asks.
There is no ETA or even to say it's lighter necessarily, because it's essentially it's like one feature after another, slightly reduced or relaxed or simplified, but it's not like a separate v0.js. It's going to be the same v0.js. I think if you look at it over time, it's been v0.js been falling in size quite dramatically. We've been switching to newer and modernizing browser APIs. And at some point, I think we will just probably make an announcement that, okay, we are kind of happy with v0.js running, like making a few assumptions about AMP page. One thing to look for is, and I may be speaking a little bit out of my turn here, but we have, I can't find right now the experiment, but you can look it up. There is an experiment that runs a resource manager, essentially completely through the session observer. There are new session observer features that they just launched in all three browsers, actually. It just launched yesterday in Safari, that allow much better task scheduling. And we hope that sometime soon, AMP will take full advantage of it. And we already have an experiment. We had it for some time. So we're just testing it. When that happens, it's going to be like a big bulk of assumptions will fall off. Some work is related to context API. I would say once we support full React context API, we will also be pretty much closer to this goal. And that's work ongoing right now. And just so you know, just as an aside, context API in React is an API that allows components to talk to each other in the different parts of a component tree. So they're not necessarily a parent or a child. They're separated by a number of layers, but they can still communicate to each other easily. Once we have that as well, we will be in a much lighter v0.js world.
I saw Chris unmuted his video. Were you going to follow up on that, Chris?
Yeah, so the lighter v0 is actually well under development for even the current existing AMP documents. If you're interested in more details, I'd recommend joining the WG Performance group, who's been working on that. It's very close to launching on, say, the Google AMP Cache and the AMP Optimizer. So if you want more details, that's the place to go for that.